This is the Cover 3 Tailgate. And welcome back to the Cover 3 podcast here on CBS Sports. That's Bud Elliott. That's Tom Fernelli. That's Danny Cannell. That's Andrew Ivins of 247 Sports. You have heard his voice. You have seen his face here on the Cover 3 podcast before. We are excited to welcome him back because coming up a little bit later in the show, we are going to dip into his expertise because the 2025 cycle is off and rolling. We want to know the early movers, the names you need to know, the storylines to follow as recruiting, will really start to pick up here in the coming months. We always know June is huge. We always know that a lot goes on before we start to get into that fall camp time. But good gravy. We got a lot to talk about that's going on across the world of college football. So Clemson has filed a lawsuit against the ACC in South Carolina. A couple things that stand out to me. Obviously, we're going to be going to billable hours for this one. So, Bud, number one, some of it seems to be very much in line with Florida State. And by some of it, I mean your exit fees and your claim to our media rights into the future. That's not fair. It's like basically said like, hey, judge, please tell us that's not fair. It doesn't feel fair. Look at all these other exit fees. Look at all these other conferences and the way they handle their business. The way that they are doing this is egregious. Number two, the timing. This comes out right after the new college football playoff media rights deal has been signed, which means that it has been put publicly in very plain numbers. The ACC is going to be a little brother. I mean, it's something a lot of people knew, but it just shows the millions of dollars that are going to be in that gap between the Big Ten and the SEC. And finally, Bud, they also included this sweet, sweet little note. Hey, we never agreed to sue Florida State. Like Clemson being able to come out and say, no one ever asked us why the ACC countersue Florida State. We never said that. Lots of different ways that I think the Tigers have been very crafty with this. What's your read on the Clemson lawsuit against the ACC?
Yeah, so most of this looks very similar to what FSU is suing over. We covered this in billable hours a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago. Whenever the FSU suit came out, a lot of these states have a law that basically says, okay, this exit fee has to bear like a real resemblance to the actual damages suffered by what you're exiting, right? Otherwise, it's punitive, it's considered a penalty, and it's not allowable under state law. That's essentially what Clemson is arguing here, much like FSU did under the law in the state of Florida. The most interesting thing that I got from this suit was Clemson's claim, which I don't think will succeed. But it is interesting to just throw this out there, and everybody pleads everything, and then you just, you kind of pick and choose what the judge will allow. But Clemson is claiming that the granting of rights only applies for so long as Clemson is in the league, meaning, yes, you signed a deal through 2036, in theory, assuming ESPN picks up the option next year to continue the deal through 2036. However, Clemson's like, yeah, if we leave, that granting of rights, that's null and void. And I don't think I've ever seen a grant of rights interpreted in that way, but also we have not had very many test cases. So it is somewhat interesting that Clemson would think to plead that because if the court says, yeah, Clemson, you're right on that, every conference blows up immediately, right? Like you can be like, hey, we're leaving and you guys don't get to keep our rights. The other interesting point, as you noted, Chip, was Clemson saying, hey, we did not agree to sue Florida State. Now, this is important because of the timing of the lawsuit. Remember, the ACC preemptively filed a lawsuit for declaration that Florida State's lawsuit was not valid and that any kind of suit would have to be heard in North Carolina court. They're in a venue fight right now. So the state of Florida is where FSU wants theirs heard. Obviously, the ACC wants to play a home game and have theirs in North Carolina, much like I'm sure Clemson will want to have its suit heard in South Carolina. Now, the ACC bylaws say that you need to have unanimous voting or some kind of vote at least to sue a school. But the ACC is interpreting this differently. Clemson's saying, hey, like we never voted on this. So Clemson is essentially declaring, we read this the same way that Florida State reads this. Like we were not, in agreement with suing FSU here. It came out that there were like 6 or 7 schools that voted in favor of having a meeting to discuss suing, but I don't know that they ever actually took a real vote on this. So this is actually sort of important, because if it's determined that they actually do have to have a vote on this and it was never held, then in terms of timeliness, the ACC suit is not valid because they did not follow their own bylaws, and thus the ACC would have to refile later in time than when Florida State filed, which would, in theory, give FSU a leg up in terms of hosting venue. And I'm going to take a drink now. So there's a lot of talking in a row.
Hey, no, this is what we do. Like, I'll tell you what, man, other shows can't be able to flex this because we have an attorney right here on the Cover 3 podcast that can give you the technicalities of it all. So we're not flying blind. I mean, I would just throw things out there. So now let's get to that stage of it. Danny.
Thank you.
Like, when you're thinking about the politics of this, and I know that you've talked to some people around Florida State and just trying to like game this out. What does it feel like we are working towards in terms of the big picture here?
Florida State, Clemson getting out.
Is that it?
That's what it's always been about. I think there's no surprise. Like Florida State and Clemson have always been attached at the hip behind the scenes. I think this just makes it more official that they are kind of in this together, and that they are. I mean, how many times has Bud said, Florida State and Clemson are the teams that have a desire to compete for national championships. Miami, you can throw them in there too, but they haven't done it in a long time. But Florida State and Clemson, currently the most relevant teams that are doing that. To have that duo together, I think there is strength in that. And I'm sure there's probably, I don't know if it's a sigh of relief, but like okay, it's about time. Like, let's go from Florida State's people that have known this, but Clemson's been able to kind of fly under the radar and not take some of the heat that Florida State has. It's just 2 different modes that they've gone about it. But here we are with the same place where they both want to get out and realize. And I think a lot of it does have to do. I think there was probably some that were holding out hope with the new college football playoff, with the revenue share, with the splits. Maybe it would be closer than we think, when we realize it's there and it's only going to get worse, because it was already double with the TV deal. Now with the playoff deal, you're looking at double again. Like, that's a massive number. I even saw an anonymous ACC administrator admit that. Like, in one of the articles I was reading, I forget who had read it, whether it was Ross or, Pete Thamel or whoever it was, said like they talked to an ACC administrator who said, combine this now with the already, the deficit they're already facing with the TV deal. This isn't surprising to the ACC either.
So I want to go back to that. Actually, this is really interesting. Why now for Clemson? Because like for me, there's 3 options. One, they don't feel good about the upcoming hearing for the Noles, so they want to like throw their iron in the fire to maybe have some kind of positive momentum against the ACC. 2, this new playoff deal, which sort of is the ACC putting in writing that they're inferior to the SEC, which we know they are, but it is
right.
Look, we talked about this on 2 Mondays ago. This is a tough thing for Jim Phillips, the ACC commissioner, to agree to, because you're literally saying, yeah, we're inferior. And meanwhile, like that's part of the crux of FSU's suit. It's like, hey, you guys have not stewarded this league very well. Or number 3, did Clemson get assurance that they have a spot if they jump? Because I've long thought that Florida State does have a spot from the Big Ten. In fact, I would like bet my house on it. But like that they really that they have a spot.
It's a big bet.
If they can get their
Does
right.
the Big Ten get your house if they don't take Florida
I was
State?
about to say, like that's.
Hey, all you know is there's a lot of guys from Chicago that moved down here, Tom. So,
Tony Petitti's like, I got me a new vacation house. Come to the golf cart.
We're on the
Tony Petitti gets the golf cart. That's what I was thinking.
But did Clemson get assurance? Because I don't think Clemson, as we traditionally thought about the Big Ten, would be a good Big Ten fit academically, right? But maybe that's all changing because this is no longer really about school and academics and stuff, at least in theory. Or did they kind of get a wink, wink, nod, nod from the SEC?
Andrew, what's Either number one, if you got big picture thoughts, I would love to hear them. But I also know that you've got a unique angle into this from talking to personnel people, from talking to coaches, from talking to recruits, and how much of that trickles all the way down to like those sort of day-to-day stuff, because this is all so big and high level that, I'm just not sure if that connection is strong or whether those storylines and those narratives get all the way down to the families and the coaches and the recruiting process. What's the sense that you've gotten in terms of how things are changing?
Well, I'm going to be clear. I don't have a law degree like my fellow Orlando resident Bud over there. So I don't really have any big picture takeaways. I mean, to me, it feels like we are going towards a Power 2 conferences, right? I mean, in Florida State, Clemson, they seem to fit. I mean, you said you could put the Tigers in the Big Ten. I think they're fit in the SEC. I mean, you guys have been to Death Valley, that stadium, the fan base. Like, to me, it feels like an SEC school. When it comes to the recruits, I mean, you ask these prospects about conference realignment. The editors would always be like, ask these guys about this school moving to there. I don't think any of them really care. It's gone so much from facilities and get me to the NFL to, all right, well, how much am I getting paid at X program? It's not even who the coach is there. What are you guys going to do for me off the field? In terms of the administrators, I think a lot of my contacts at the lower levels are just kind of concerned about the direction this is headed. And if they went to collective bargaining, how many recruiting support staffs are going to be trimmed down at the lower levels. So I think there is a sense of urgency maybe to get to, all right, I want to be in the Big Ten. I want to be in the SEC because I know that's where all the money's going to go and it's going to hang on. So I don't know. The recruits to me, like, kids want to play in the SEC. That rings true. But to me, I don't hear much about big picture, Clemson suing, FSU suing. That never really comes up.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, it barely comes up with like our peers that don't work in the business. They just want to tell me like, when's the home game? Where's my parking spot? Like, how is it going to fall in line with our social schedule? I mean, that's more of the common college football fan, I feel like. Sorry, Danny, didn't mean to cut you off.
I was going to say, don't you think in recruiting, the Big Ten and SEC are using this against Florida State and Clemson?
Yes.
Yeah,
well,
that's where I think it would come in. Where I think ultimately, like Andrew's saying, like, it's about the money. What can you do for me? But I guarantee when they're talking to SEC and Big Ten coaches, and if it's a dogfight between FSU and Alabama, they're going to say, "Hey, Florida State, they might be stuck. They might be left behind. They're suing to get out. You don't want to take that chance." So I do think it's being. I mean, everything is open season in recruiting. We know how that works. So I'm sure this is something that's used negatively against the ACC schools.
I think Mike Norvell's equipped to go head to head. And I think with Dabo, they kind of recruit a different type of individual. So yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, you look at Florida State last season, not getting into the playoff. I'm sure as some of those head coaches sat down in living rooms, that was brought up. But hey, we might be getting away from in-home coach visits if this recruiting calendar changes. Maybe it doesn't even matter.
I did think you talk about the wink, wink, nod, nod. There was a line in the lawsuit which was saying that it was the ACC grant of rights was preventing Clemson from exploring other opportunities, which means that they are putting in a lawsuit what we have said with our analysis, that these schools are valuable and the Big Ten and the SEC are interested in the very few chips that are left on the table that add value. But those conferences also don't want to get involved in a huge, messy legal battle. So they're telling Clemson, you go get your house in order, you clean up all this, then we'll come. So is there a wink, wink, nod, nod for Clemson? I'm not sure. But they put in that lawsuit that this with the ACC is preventing them from being able to go out and test the open market, where they believe, whether wink, wink, nod, nod, or just their own confidence, that they're going to be able to have offers out there.
I will say to that point, like Bud said, he's pretty confident Florida State's got a landing spot in the Big Ten. I don't know what the current leadership of the Big Ten, how they really think and how they're going to approach this. I know that historically, based on how the conference has been run, I feel like Florida State, North Carolina, and Virginia would all be far more attractive to the Big Ten than Clemson. Now, that might be different with new leadership coming more from the television side, where maybe they would look at Clemson and say we would rather have them just because of their football prowess. But based on what I know, I think if Clemson's going anywhere, the SEC is more likely, even though they already have South Carolina.
Yeah, well, South Carolina also might find themselves in that Texas A&M position where, Texas A&M's like, what? No, don't bring in Texas. And everybody else is like, no, we want Texas. I think that South Carolina, even if they put their hands up and say, don't bring in Clemson, I don't know if their vote is going to be holding enough weight in that room. Okay, we got one more thing we got to hit to before we jump into recruiting, and it's very much tied to recruiting because it's tied to recruiting in the modern era, in the portal era, with one of the most talented offensive linemen in the entire sport. Alabama, Iowa, Alabama? We'll explain next. It's bracket time, so get yours in now on the CBS Sports app. You can play in men's and women's pools with friends and join our challenges for the chance to win a new Nissan Rogue and trips to the 2025 Final Four. Get the CBS Sports app or visit cbssports.com/cover3 to start filling out your brackets. No purchase necessary. See terms and rules for details. If you're watching on YouTube, you see it right there. cbssports.com/cover3. Come get in the Cover 3 Bracket Challenge where you can compete against the bracket that was submitted. I know it looked like it was stalling out if you were watching live, but I double-checked. The Cover 3 Bracket Challenge does have my, if it was college football, Texas over Clemson in the national championship game, over under of 63 total points scored in the game. That is a real submission with my name in the Cover 3 Bracket Challenge. So go ahead and see if you can go and beat that.
I mean, 63 points seems pretty low, but we did watch Virginia last night against Colorado State. So I don't know.
They had me write up the results for cbssports.com as like a fun story. And in my conclusion, I said, a 7 seed over a 6 seed, you go back to the UConn, Kentucky of 2014. We had higher seeds meet in the national championship game. I said that would be surprising, stunning, but not historic. If we had 63 total points in the national championship game, that'd be setting basketball back decades. James Naismith and his peach baskets rolling over in their grave, having to watch that happen.
It was the Butler title game. Was it against North Carolina a few years ago where it was like really low scoring in the first half?
But Butler didn't play against North Carolina. Butler's second tie, they were back-to-back in 10
There was some game where it was like 20-18.
Was it Nova?
Oh, it was gross.
Yeah, it might have been Nova. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So big news out there in the transfer portal era, because after Nick Saban retires, Alabama loses 5-star Caleb Downs, 5-star offensive tackle Kaydyn Proctor. Proctor says he's going to Iowa. He's at the basketball game talking about, all this, great positivity that he's received from his old friends. And now we get news this week. Kaydyn Proctor will be leaving the program. Kirk Ferentz said we wish him well. And all reports are indicating Proctor's headed back to Alabama. Andrew, what does this say? First of all, what does this say about Alabama? And then, like, in general, is this as big a surprise to you as it was to me?
Yeah, it's a bombshell, right? I mean, that's the term. And I think this is the one that's going to open up eyes for a lot of people, hopefully. I'm all for, player movement, player empowerment, all that stuff. But what if you're Iowa and the day before spring practices, a franchise prototypical left tackle's like, hey, I'm out. So let's kind of relate this to like an NFL franchise. You sign this big free agent, window closes, and then the day before practice, he says, I'm just leaving. Iowa, probably more than 70% of the programs around the country is equipped to maybe handle a left tackle walking outside the door, but this would be backbreaking for, your favorite school out there, because how are you going to adjust? And I know there's going to be another transfer portal window. You can go and get another offensive tackle. But I was going through this morning our offensive tackle rankings from the 2023 transfer cycle. Yeah, the top 4 guys, they all played over 800 snaps at tackle. But behind that, it was a bunch of guys that played guard or were injured or never panned out. I mean, it's a premium position. So to me, my reaction is kind of, what are we doing? There's no real guardrails in place. And I think it's easy. Yeah. I mean, let the players do what they want to do. But I mean, if you're an Iowa staffer this morning, I think you're waking up and wondering, what am I doing here in terms of roster management and trying to build a program? And I think the other thing, if you're, contribute to the Iowa collective, are you waking up this morning and going, why am I doing this at this point? So that's kind of my reaction just on the Kaydyn Proctor news.
So you can leave home again.
Love it. Couple things I think this says. One, I think Bama's collective is getting their money right, which is something that we had said they needed to do. Because, Saban wasn't raising money for the collective wasn't really high on Saban's list of things to do. I think that's one of the reasons he was frustrated. We talked about fewer kids being willing to take the Bama discount. So looks like Bama can pay full freight now. Now, apparently Iowa's collective, I'm reading this from the chat, but it's from a guy I know is an Iowa fan, and he's in our chat a lot. Their CEO stated Proctor got nothing from the fan portion of the collective and very little from the corporate side. His contract will be void with the collective. So maybe Iowa structured this thing with this possibility in mind. I think this is actually good for the sport. Not that it's a long-term thing, but I think the absurdity of the move, right, that we're having guys bounce to multiple schools within the same semester does speed up the process of where we probably need to get. And ultimately, it's going to just be a choice the schools have to make. Do we want to keep all the money for ourselves, or do we want to exert some level of control over the player? I think we're going to have more stories like this, and I think it's going to really suck in the short term. But I think long term, they actually probably need things to point to in Congress. Look at this. This is really bad for academics. And it probably is, actually, for you to be at multiple schools in the same semester repeatedly. But having these nice newsworthy items really does sort of help, I think, the schools ultimately reach where they probably need to get. But that's not the transfer I think we were going to talk about. Did you guys see that Troy Dannon left Washington for Nebraska as the athletic director after only 5 months? We're all thinking about Kaydyn Proctor leaving. I get it. But Troy Dannon leaving Washington is going to cause people to get fired and lose their jobs because the new guy is going to want to bring in his own people. That's a much bigger deal to me. Just these guys bouncing like crazy, and we're going to make a big deal out of the player leaving because he's a far sexier name. But administrators and coaches do this stuff all the time. So it's a little bit hypocritical of us to say that that's bad for the sport. I think they're kind of both bad for the health of the sport. I don't think this portal stuff is actually good.
First of all, Troy Dannon just wanted a day off. He got to Washington 5 months ago. They reached the title game. His coach leaves. He has to hire a new football coach. He fires his basketball coach. And then before he hires the replacement, he's leaving for Nebraska. That man was like, this was a long-ass 5 months. I'm going to go to Lincoln and chill out for a few weeks. Basketball and football are set for at least 2 more years.
There's a buyout involved there, though, right? I mean, that's kind of goes to the need of why we need this for the player side. So at least if this does happen, the school gets something in return there. I am very disappointed in you guys just assuming that this is about the money, because he did go with his buddies on spring break. I mean, from Alabama, he reunited with them. What if he's all in on a championship and it's not about the money? I kid, because we all know that is not absolutely what is happening here whatsoever. No, I'm with Bud. I'm with Andrew. I think this could potentially be that this is what makes Congress, makes whoever needs to wake up and say, all right, here we are. I mean, it's not that it's why it's right in your face because he did shift schools. Because, if you talk to Pat Narduzzi about Jordan Addison when he had won the Biletnikoff, they had a deal in place for him that was an NIL deal that they thought was going to be good enough and he was all back and it was gung-ho, and then he leaves for USC, and we know how that played out. Narduzzi was pissed. But it was kind of like it didn't feel as bad because he didn't leave and then come back. This one is so glaringly in your face of how serious of a problem this is and how impossible it is to regulate and create a roster. I mean, that's where the coaches are frustrated because, you are trying to structure things. We're talking about the importance of the general manager position and having guys and, getting the best roster, but also in your younger players, having them staggered so you can have a starter come in. It's impossible. Like, good luck. And yeah, they'll probably be able to replace them. But what if they had somebody who was really good? Maybe it was a 4-star or somebody else that they were going to sign pre-spring to get practice starts today. Like, they are losing that off somebody, because they're losing a player that was starting caliber and a stud in Proctor. So I think it's absolutely it's a problem that I think is going to come to the forefront because of cases like this. There's also, this is going to open up a lot of people's eyes that are potentially going to say, man, if they did it, why can't we?
Do you remember like when you were in college and your friend broke up with a girl he'd been dating for a while that you didn't like, but even though they broke up, you didn't want to say anything about it just in case they got back together? Mm-hmm. I want to know how Alabama fans are responding to this news, because the first thing I thought of yesterday when this broke, besides the shock of it coming through, the first thing I thought of was the one Alabama fan. He was one of many who were just talking about how Proctor wasn't that good anyway. They didn't need him. They were coping. But there was the one guy who told me that it was fine because Kaydyn Proctor was a system left tackle and he wouldn't work in Kalen DeBoer and Ryan Grubb's system. Left tackle. Now, I just need to know, is that like, did they change the system to make Kaydyn Proctor fit again? Or how are we feeling, Alabama fans? Were we just kidding? We loved you all along, Kaydyn. Ha, ha, ha.
If your system
I want to know.
Yeah.
I want to know on the spring break trip, this reunion tour, was Caleb Downs there too? I mean, because that, like, if you want to really blow up the college football world, imagine him. Because, I mean, Iowa's one thing. And I don't think people feel, and it's an offensive lineman. Like, I don't think people are that upset about it. But if you threw in Ohio State in the mix and he went back, or Quinshot Judkins went back to Ole Miss, oh my goodness. If you want to see just like World War III on a level in college football like we've never seen before, if either of those two return to their schools in a similar fashion, oh my goodness.
We've seen this. I think we're going to keep seeing this, by the way. Like,
yeah.
I mean, DJ Lundy, he's not a good player, but like, he's okay. Like, he went from Florida State to Colorado and bounced back after 4 weeks. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this in the spring window.
Well, look, this is happening to try and tie the boring topics with the ball topics that we can talk about in terms of these players and depth charts and roster management. It is because the judge ruled right now that multiple transfers are fair game. Mm-hmm. Like, we are in this no man's land when it comes to eligibility. NCAA is fighting against the multiple transfer case. They're fighting against the back pay of NIL case and about whether you can be, in enforcement on any kind of NIL inducements. And in the multiple transfers case, the judge is ruling that they can't enforce any of these multiple transfer rules. That opens the door, as long as you can make it work with admissions, right? And I guess you can always make it work with admissions. This is how we're going to be seeing this. And so are we just going to run with, you talk about guardrails, Andrew, is are we just going to run like this until we get to employment?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at, okay, what are the long-term effects? I think you're only going to see more coaches leaving for the NFL. I think we're getting closer to the NFL model in college football. I think we are getting as close as we can. High school recruiting is your NFL draft. Transfer portal is your free agency. But when NFL franchises lose someone like a Kaydyn Proctor, they're getting a compensatory pick. I was getting nothing out of this. And Kaydyn Proctor is a kid that has visited that school over 24 times. He's been committed to them twice. I saw a tweet yesterday. I wish I had it pulled up. It was from some fan. It was Kaydyn Proctor's career at Iowa. 2 commitments, 2 decommitments, 0 practices, 0 games, 1 NCAA violation. It's like, I think there's a lot of people in college football working in those buildings that are going to be fed up unless there is some type of, just establish some rules here and make it so this isn't a 365, 24 hours a day type of transactional management when it comes to the rosters.
And I think a lot of them would give up some money in order for that trade-off too. Like that's really kind of the choice, right? Because like they make what they make because the players aren't paid. Trev Alberts yesterday in his opening press conference said that he expects the payroll for college football teams to immediately be $20 million, right? And that's something like they got to be planning for. So, but I think a lot of the guys that, Ivins, I'm sure it's the same way. Like they're like, yeah, I would take a little bit less to have like some more defined days off.
Quality of life.
Yeah, exactly. We talked about how a lot of these guys, they say they want to go to the NFL, but they can't because then their wife would have to go back to work, right? Or like if they're making, 800 living in kind of a more rural spot, you can't go to the Rams for 250 because then it's just a totally different quality of life living in a city with a crazy, cost of living. But I think as far as staying in college, they would take some pay cut in order just to achieve some quality of life.
All right, we got to get to the recruiting stuff. I can't let Andrew just get lost in the sauce with us talking about the future of college football. We will continue to have those conversations. We'll continue to invite Andrew back, but he's got expertise that we want to share with you. So coming up on the other side, the biggest storylines, the names to know, an update on the 2025 cycle in recruiting. Next.
Bracket season is here. Join the madness by playing the official bracket game of the NCAA. Get the CBS Sports app and be part of the madness.
Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, we are thrilled to be joined with our friend 247 Sports Andrew Irvins. Let's start with the big picture sort of team rankings. Let's take a look at where we're standing right now. Andrew, why don't you sort of talk us through some of the stuff that stands out to you about what we've got here at the top?
Marcus Freeman, Notre Dame, number 1 right now, and that's weighted heavily by the fact that they got 18 commitments. I don't think there's any other school with more than 11. Obviously, you got LSU, Penn State, Clemson right there with 11. I think the other thing, maybe a lot, your common or casual college football fan seeing the Tigers at 3 is a bit surprising. I love what they're doing on the recruiting trail here. I think Dabo going outside of his coaching tree, hiring Matt Luke, hiring Nick Eason, Chris Rump, that has not been talked about enough. Those guys have done an excellent job on the recruiting trail. And then Brian Kelly in the Tigers sitting at number 2. They got the number 1 quarterback in the country committed, the number 1 wide receiver in the country committed. And then, you can make a case that their running back is running back 1. And then finally, Ohio State, their class, they have 2 5-star cornerbacks committed. I continue to get asked on the 247 Sports airways, like this is the best cornerback duo since when? I don't even know if it's been done before. They got 2 top 10 corners committed. Top 10 players nationally, and they both play cornerback.
Decent.
I want to talk about the Irish here a little bit. I go down this list. Everybody has a famous dad who played in the league. Like this is kind of crazy. Plaxico Burress's kid, Jerome Bettis's kid, Ike Taylor. This is a seriously good class for Notre Dame. And I know it's certainly propped up by volume, but I think we also have to be fairly impressed by the quality of player they're getting.
Yeah, I think Marcus Freeman, what has he done since he's taken over for Brian Kelly? I think he has rebuilt that quarterback room, and they've gone and they've gotten transfers, but the guys they've got from the high school ranks, we're really fired up about. Kenny Minchie 2 cycles ago. This past cycle, it was CJ Carr, grandson of Lloyd Carr. A lot of people thought he would go to Michigan. And then here in the 25 cycle, they have this kid Deuce Knight committed out of Mississippi. I think he is the biggest wild card of the 2025 quarterbacks. He's a lefty. He can run. He's got a 40-inch vertical jump. It's like one of the highest I've ever seen for a quarterback. So he has revitalized that room in terms of the balance between experience and then potential. The floor and the ceiling continues to rise. And then on those NFL legacies, I'm going to start calling Notre Dame like NFLU. And I don't know if this is by design that the Irish have gone after all these like high profile, like legacy kids. I do think their evaluation process and the guys they are targeting, it feels a little bit different than when Brian Kelly was there. But I think Notre Dame, it appeals to a lot of these former NFL players. Those guys are in locker rooms. They see guys from all different parts of the country. And I think the Notre Dame brand stands out to guys that have been in the league. And, Jerome Bettis's kid, Ike Taylor's kid, Plaxico Burris's kid. There's just a lot of them there. And they're all high floor, high IQ football players. So it's a really good recruiting class. And there's still some big fish out there for Notre Dame.
I mean, we're watching Burris's kid here on the screen right now. Like, he even kind of glides like Dad did. It's just smooth and just the soft hands. That's awesome, man. I'm curious to see, like, Notre Dame. The question has been, like, can they win on like the top 10, top 15 level prospect down the stretch? But I don't think there's any doubt that Freeman is bringing in more of those like top 247 kids than Brian Kelly did. So like I do see like some improvements from them statistically in the recruiting thing. And I think like the Irish fans in our chat, that's basically just like, can they land that like top 10 kid down the stretch? A Keon Keeley 2 cycles ago, right?
And I think that, the expanded 12 team, or is it a 14 team playoff now? I can't keep track. I think Notre Dame's kind of like, I don't steal a March Madness phrase. Like, I think every season they're kind of on the bubble, right? Going in, like you would have them as a contender to get a playoff spot. So what happens if they do break through into the playoff? Does that unlock them and allow them to get, a 5-star, one of the top 32 players in the country? I think Notre Dame's done a good job recruiting and building out the back end of that roster. But like you said, bringing in the 4-star prospects, the guys that can play and make an impact, be multi-year starters. I mean, they are elevating that roster, and they're adding talent through the transfer portal as well. It's been a good balance, a good mix. Rattle off some 10-win seasons, 12-win seasons. Maybe they do get a Keon Keeley. Maybe that is the answer for them.
Danny, what do you remember about the Notre Dame mystique from NFL locker rooms?
Similar to Michigan. I think there's definitely, we're special, we're different than everybody else. There's a little bit of an arrogance too. But definitely even more so, I'd say, with Notre Dame, just because of the historical aspect of it. It's because it's not, especially now, like regionally, it's not attractive to go there and play. It's cold. It's in the middle of nowhere. So they really have to sell a lot of that tradition. But now they're able to sell success too. I think a lot of this is direct result. Talking about the Marcus Freeman is one of the more impressive dudes you'll talk to. Like, like this is no surprise that former players would be attracted to him. I mean, Jerome Bettis is like that makes a ton of sense. But some of these other guys, like the reason they're sending their kids there and entrusting them, I think it's because of Marcus Freeman and what he brings to the table.
I just think it's a good school. I think about the children of athletes who I knew. I tell you where they weren't going to, the same schools I was going to. Like they were placed in opportunities that were different, and being at Notre Dame is different. So it's like, that's where, if you are, you have all of this NFL success, you've had the success that comes with that. You can provide some opportunities for your kid. And if you can, if you still believe in the educational and the college experience, Notre Dame's probably a place that's pretty attractive to you.
Only one thing I want to push back on what you said, Danny, where you said Notre Dame's in the middle of nowhere. I would agree that for the most part, Indiana as a state is the middle of nowhere, but South Bend's like an hour drive away from Chicago. So it's like, if you want to go have fun on a weekend, you're not exactly far away from it.
Yeah, shout out to St. Patrick's Day and the Chicago Bears trading Justin Fields on St. Patrick's Day in Chicago. What in the world?
The fights.
All things Green River. All right. Yeah. All right. So we were talking a lot about the boom in Tuscaloosa when you know that Kaydyn Proctor is going to be returning. Andrew, what is your sense of Kalen DeBoer, this staff, which underwent changes, even as Ryan Grubb's sitting there, 3 days before signing day, I am your offensive coordinator. Then you have to rework the staff again and rework the staff again. How do you think that group, as it stands right now, is looking in the 2025 cycle?
I think Bud kind of touched on this a little bit earlier in the show about Alabama getting aligned with the people that support the program. Look, when DeBoer was hired, I think for me and a lot of my colleagues, the question was, all right, how is he going to handle recruiting in the state of Alabama. More importantly, in this kind of like new look SEC. Remember, Hugh Freeze is at Auburn. You got Lane Kiffin, Ole Miss, a ton of excitement there. And DeBoer is a guy that's recruited on the West Coast. We know he's X's and O's scheme. He's going to scheme you up. He's going to win football games, but he's never really had these magical recruiting classes at the upper levels of the college football sport. So I wanted to see, all right, what's he going to do? And when Nick Saban retired, that 2025 recruiting class, I thought it was a kind of a shoo-in to be the number one class in the country. I mean, they had a ton of guys committed. Well, most of those guys backed off their pledges. So DeBoer coming in from Washington, where there's not a ton of crossover in terms of the targets you're recruiting at Alabama, it was kind of like, what's going to happen? And I think coming out of this dead period in February, I'm feeling good about Alabama and the Crimson Tide in terms of what DeBoer's got in place. He's hired a ton of veteran coaches, guys with experience in the SEC. Right now, they're sitting 13th in the rankings. This is normally where Alabama and Nick Saban are at this stage in the cycle. I always say Nick Saban takes the car out of the garage and then he puts it in drive, May, June, July. That's when they kind of load up on commitments. And I think for DeBoer, it's going to be similar. They just got a big win. Derek Smith, a two-way athlete out of the Yellowhammer State, could be a safety, could be a wide receiver. That was a big one. He's a top 64 prospect for us, a guy that we really, really like. And then he went into the DMV and got another kind of two-way athlete. I think they're going to play him at defensive back. And just talking with some of the guys in our network at our Alabama site, Brett Greenberg, it sounds like Alabama's going to have some fireworks here over the next few days. Daryl Johnson, a top 247 linebacker out of Georgia. He's going to make a commitment this afternoon on the 247 Sports YouTube channel. Alabama leads on the crystal ball. I think that's a massive win for the Crimson Tide if he does pick them. Talked with Daryl Johnson a few months ago. I think it was back in January at a camp outside of Atlanta. He didn't even talk about Alabama. It was all Florida State, Tennessee, these other schools. So Alabama's kind of figuring it out real fast. And I'm excited to see how this class comes together over the next few months. And then what happens on the field, because I think a lot of recruits are going to be looking at Tuscaloosa to see, all right, are they going to win games? Are they still going to get me to the NFL? Because when Nick Saban was there at Alabama, that was a big sell. You go there, you're going to go likely be a day 1, day 2 NFL draft pick, and you're going to get paid in the league.
You mentioned Clemson hiring Nick Easton and Rump, and it's showing up in their recruiting immediately. Like their top three recruits are all defensive linemen. Like this is a group you got to be pretty. I know Clemson's like done the best job of producing defensive linemen in the ACC for a while, but like this is a really nice group they're putting together.
Yeah, I mean, I love the defensive line class, but how about the offensive line class? Matt Luke. That hire has not been talked about enough. We know the Tigers aren't going to go in the transfer portal under the direction of Dabo. So the margin for error is so slim. Like they have to volume shoot on their offensive linemen, and they have to hit on a lot of them. And they got to play these guys early. The one recruit I kind of have circled, all right, is Clemson going to get this guy? Is David Sanders Jr., our number 1 ranked offensive tackle, number 2 player in the country. Talking with a few different people, he wasn't even considering Clemson until Matt Luke was hired. I think the Tigers are in the driver's seat right now, and they're going head-to-head with Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina. All the big programs want David Sanders. He's a lean offensive tackle. Kind of reminds me of Charles Cross, who was at Mississippi State. Now he's with the Seattle Seahawks. It's going to take some time, but this is a franchise or team-changing type of player. And he's visited Death Valley 3 times already this spring. Rule of thumb in recruiting, kind of follow the visit. So if they can reel him in, I feel really good about the direction that Clemson is heading here. And I think a lot of people are selling stock. Look, I get it. I mean, there's been some struggles. They're not in the transfer portal like everyone else, but I really like the class they have. I liked what they signed last cycle. And the thing is, I think a lot of these guys can play early, and they have to do that there for the Tigers because there is no veteran coming in. Like next man up is normally a freshman for the Tigers.
Have you seen the clips of him running routes? David Sanders?
David Sanders?
Dude, he is one of the best athletes on his team, like
So-
regardless of position. I know he's close to 300 pounds. It's
So I do a freaks list every year, like the freakiest recruits. It's kind of like Feldman with his, college football players. It's not as in depth. I don't got a bunch of, agents telling me different things and strength coaches.
And you
it's
don't
me-
retweet it.
agents tell Ivins
draft.
It's more me doing the legwork, but David Sanders is like absolutely a lock. I mean, over 50 feet in the shot put. He, as a junior, he was protecting Jaden Davis, the quarterback that signed with Michigan. He was his left tackle, played like the entire season with a torn labrum, but he also went two ways, played defensive end. And I think like if he just built himself as a pass rusher, he would be a top 247 defensive end for us. I had a college staffer at an SEC program be like, he'd be a top 5 D end on our board. Power cleans 315. He's got like a swimming background. I mean, he just is a box checker for us. So he's an elite talent. And I'll never forget the first time I saw him, Bud. It was at that FBU freshman All-American game like 3 years ago. I'm like, who is this kid? And he's panned out and continued to progress.
there's a little bit. He's not as wide and he's not as thick at the same age, but there's a little bit of like the Amarius Mims thing, where it's just like, holy cow! Like if you just stay healthy for 3 years of college ball, like it's hard to see a guy with that body and that ability, like assuming he develops at least a little bit, like not be a top half of the draft type pick. I mean, it's just there's not a guy like that in every single class. Even it's not like, oh, who's this year's David Sanders? Maybe last year there wasn't a David Sanders.
Well, I mean, all the NFL media drooled and scouts over Amarius Mims at the combine. It's kind of the same thing with David Sanders. I mean, it's a height, weight, speed game. What can you do? And when you look at our rankings at 247 Sports, we're going to push those guys up the board, right? Those are the guys that are going to get selected early on. And David Sanders is certainly in that same category.
No doubt.
When was our last update of the player rankings?
Two, 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Take us through some of the top quarterbacks. So what does that picture look like in terms of some of the players who are at the top here as we're still going into the camp cycle that they'll have this summer?
Right. So I've built it as like the big four, and you got Bryce Underwood at the top. He's a kid out of the Detroit area. He's the most decorated signal caller of the bunch. I mean, he's 40-2 as a starter, 3-year kid. He can beat you with his arm. He can beat you with his legs. He's 6'3", 200 pounds. I've been looking for a player comp. And he reminds me a little bit of Deshaun Watson. Like that's the guy I've settled on. He is headed to LSU. It was a big win for Brian Kelly and Joe Sloan. I think the fact that they had a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback and Jaden Daniels certainly helped push Bryce Underwood towards Baton Rouge. So sounds like he's locked in. He's the real deal. He's the most decorated of the bunch. The guy number 2 behind him in this big four is Tavian St. Clair, who was committed to Ohio State, which, I'm sure everyone's familiar with all the quarterback talent.
Yeah, I was going to say, where are the snaps in Columbus for all these dudes?
Yeah, and you got to give Ryan Day and his staff there a tip of the cap, because Tavian St. Clair was an excellent evaluation for him. He's from a smaller town in Ohio. And I did this mistake right when we were going through the junior seasons. I accidentally watched the last game of Tavian St. Clair's sophomore year. And I'm like, whoa, this is his sophomore season. So I followed it up watching the last game of his junior year. Completely different quarterback. He too has an imposing frame. I think he's very accurate to all 3 levels on the move. And, kudos to them for getting this kid committed before really the rest of the country found out about him. I mean, he was a kid that went to the summer camps there. So, yeah, they got Julian Sayin, Air Nolan, and Tavian St. Clair behind all those other guys. I mean, we loved Lincoln Kineholtz 2 cycles ago. So Tavian St. Clair is 2. Checking in at 3, George McIntyre out of the Nashville area. He is committed to Tennessee. This is a 6'5" tower, and I think he does not get enough credit for how he gets away from sacks. Like he is 6'5", but he's he's kind of a magician back there with his stride, spins out, spins away from sacks, evades pressure. His team won just 2 games as a junior. And like, we're all scratching our head. I'm like, how did they only win 2 games? And then you dig into the tape and it's not Georgia's fault. I mean, the defense was giving up like 35 points a game. They were averaging over 30. It's kind of one of the great wonders of the world, how they only won 2 games. But I think he's a perfect fit for Josh Heupel's offense. Everyone's going to know Nico Iamaleava at Tennessee after this upcoming season. I think there's some similarities between him and George McIntyre in terms of how quickly they can get the ball out and how they can attack the deeper third. So, he always wanted to be at Tennessee. He's committed there. I think he's going to stick. And then the fourth one in this quote unquote big 4, Julian Lewis out of Georgia. He was a kid that was in the class of 2026, reclassified to 2025. He is committed to USC. I'm doing that in quotation marks because he has taken a ton of visits, right? He's one of these guys that is committed, but also has a top 5. I mean, he's been to Colorado and Indiana. I think both of those are kind of interesting, but really, Georgia, Auburn, some of those programs. He's the best pure distributor of the football, in my opinion, in this class, even after reclassifying. And, I've done the homework. I've done the data. Reclassification isn't going away in college football. I know it's been a thing for a while in the world of college basketball, but with the NIL deals and all that, it's a race now to get to college. And the guys that have done it, it really hasn't panned out. I mean, JT Daniels is a name that comes to mind. But if you take Julian Lewis, you take his numbers, what he has done in Georgia's highest classification, it stacks up there with all these other 2025 quarterbacks. The big knock on him, he's not as physically gifted as those other quarterbacks ahead of him. Think of like Bryce Young. I mean, he's on the smaller side. So, that's the reason he's QB4 for us. But man, he can spray it around. I think he can play in a Lincoln Riley type of offense, up tempo, want him to be a point guard. He's going to be one where there's going to be a ton of twists and turns here over the next few months because he's taking visits.
I would think that like the reclass thing, especially for quarterbacks, I think that has to have a huge impact just because of lack of experience of playing. If you're leaving kind of a year early, I think that some positions you would probably see long-term it would work out better at. But I think like the QB position is a really difficult spot to do that.
Well, I mean, look towards the NFL draft right now. Brock Purdy has obviously turned some heads. And if you kind of follow the NFL draft media and the scouts and the guys that are plugged in, you keep hearing that front offices want, if you're going to take quarterbacks in these later rounds, they want guys that have played a ton of games, that have seen a ton of different scenarios and a ton of different situations. And I think that applies to these quarterbacks coming out of high school. You reclassify, you're missing out on a 12, 13, 14, 15 game season. You don't get those live reps back. Yeah, you're going to go learn your offense at the school of your choice. Hopefully the OC doesn't leave for another job, but you're not getting live game reps. I mean, normally you're running the scout team for that time. So yeah, I mean, Quinn Ewers did it, went to Ohio State. Now he's finding success at Texas. Jake Bentley a couple years ago, he bounced around from school to school. It's interesting. Austin Simmons was another. He jumped 2 years to leave and go to Ole Miss, and he hasn't appeared in a game yet, but he's playing baseball for them. I would agree with you, Tom. Quarterback, you definitely want them to get as many starts as you can. And the good thing for Julian Lewis is I think he's already got like 28 of them under his belt, and he's got another year to play.
The one question I have about the reclass thing, because I agree with you. Like the data is really kind of scary. Does it matter if they were a redshirt kid who is then sort of reclassifying up to the age appropriate year, right? Like Quinn Ewers did this and is going to be a hit, but Quinn Ewers would have been a 19-year-old high school senior, right? So he
was like old for his grade in 5th grade.
But yeah. Whereas Julian Lewis, he doesn't turn 17 until September 21st, based on what I was able to Google. So like he actually is like his college career, like he will like just have turned 18. So like it's 18 to 21 in theory, whereas Ewers is a little bit older. than that. So I wonder, because like a lot of these quarterback dads do like the sports red shirt thing at some point, and are they reclassifying to the age appropriate like year once they realize, hey, I'm actually pretty good? And do we think that matters, like as far as the extra year of actual like physical age?
Well, I do think the age is a big thing. I mean, it is in other sports, right? If you talk to guys that scout hockey and baseball and all that stuff, it's a big deal. I'll say this on the age thing: we're getting into these 2026 rankings, so that would be soon to be high school juniors. A lot of old kids, a lot of older birthdays. And you want to know why? It's because of the pandemic. And I don't think you can blame, families for maybe holding their kid back instead of doing online school or whatnot for an extra year, or just missing out on a year of sports. I'm noticing that as a trend in these upcoming rankings. A lot of red numbers.
I would say maybe the pandemic, but I would look at the timeline of when Malcolm Gladwell's Outlier book came out, and he talked about the hockey birthdays and keeping kids back. That might have something to do with it too. To Bud's point, a lot of these parents are psychos when it comes to setting their kids up the best chance for success. Having that being said, all three of my daughters held them back, so they'll be older.
See, Danny's a psycho too.
Sports. It wasn't even it was for everything. I do think there's an advantage to doing it.
Like July, August birthdays or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because they were the youngest in their class in kindergarten, so we had them go to kindergarten twice.
Right.
So now they're like on par, slightly older than most of the kids.
Danny had to go to kindergarten twice too, but for different reasons.
I did. My dad held me back. I had a great birthday, but I was held back, and I did kindergarten twice.
Yeah, we're doing our oldest back because he's June. So it's like, do you want to be the biggest and like the least emotionally mature? I don't know.
Yeah.
Andrew, anything else for Andrew, or like Andrew, anything stand out that we haven't gotten a chance to hit to that fans should be able to keep their eyes on or get a sense for here in the 2025 cycle?
How about USC, right? I just mentioned Julian Lewis is committed to them, but they only have one prospect committed right now. They're
one?
Yeah, just one. They're 56th in the rankings. That's behind USF, UNLV, and a ton of other schools. Just big picture, right? Trojans moving into the Big Ten. I think, Lincoln Riley there. When are they going to get it going on the recruiting trail? And they could. I mean, there is plenty of time. You look at some of the guys they signed in this 2024 class, like Cameron Fountain was a top 247 talent for us. Saw a photo tweeted out of him walking into spring practices yesterday. I'm like, okay, this is how they should look. He looks like an absolute freak. That's a team I'm keeping an eye on the recruiting trail, just because of the conference realignment, right? You're going into this line of scrimmage league. Where are you going to get your big bodies? Because a lot of these offensive linemen, they like to decide early. And I think it's maybe a bit of a down year when it comes to edge rushers and premium defensive linemen. So where are the Trojans going to find it? I'm sure the transfer portal is going to be a big focus, but you got some new staff members there. To me, USC's one, and then UCLA, they got a new staff as well, right? Chip Kelly's gone. He didn't really recruit the high school ranks all that much, and they're involved with this other quarterback. I mentioned that Big Four. The kid chasing the Big Four is Husan Longstreet out of California. I love this kid. He is 6'1.5", twitched up. I think he's got the livest arm in the cycle. He can rip it. Big 11-inch hands. He just punched his ticket to the Elite 11 finals. Texas A&M is believed to be the leader, but he's going to take visits to Auburn, Ole Miss, and UCLA. And I think that's a very interesting group of schools, especially when you think about like big picture where we are in college football right now, and what schools have funds and whatnot. Husan Longstreet, he's going to decide on April 14th, so certainly another one to track over the next few weeks.
Eyes on that. If you want more from Andrew, he is, of course, the host of the Football Recruiting Pod. You can follow him on Twitter at Andrew_Ivins. Andrew, we are so thankful for the expertise, the insight. We love chopping it up with you, and we'll be sure to have you back again.
Appreciate it, guys.
Thank you.
You can follow him on Twitter at BudElliott3. You can follow him at Tom Fernelli. You can follow him at Danny Cannell. You can follow me at Chip_Patterson. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
See ya.